So we're going to kick off with Kevin. So Kevin, if I can ask you to come and start. Thank you. I should say that before we do that, I just have a couple of questions which the audience might like to consider answering for. So there are three very quick questions. Have you ever had to deal with a surgical complication or error arising that has had a significant impact on you? So if you can vote now. I guess there was no surprise for me. So it's 88% say yes, 11, 12, 13% say no. I'm happy for you. So how well has your training prepared you to deal with the personal impact of such adverse events? So on a scale of 1 to 5, please. And looking at that, we can see that over 40%, around 40% say not at all. So clearly we're missing a trick in terms of resilience and getting our trainees and our surgeons on board to understand some of the implications of this. Nobody felt that we were doing it very well. And finally, how much has an adverse event affected your subsequent practice? So if you could vote on that. So clearly these weigh heavily. It's often said that the surgeon is a further casualty when things actually go wrong, and something that we tend to neglect. So a significant degree, once again, for almost 40% of the delegates here in the room. So Kevin, I sense you may be preaching to the converted. Welcome.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you about this important topic. I think the responses to those brief questions demonstrate that we all know that we are affected when things go wrong, but we're not very good at talking about it to each other, and we're not very good at talking about it to the people that manage us and employ us. This is a quote from Peter Yu, who is a transplant surgeon at Yale, and it's from a paper that he wrote was published within the last few weeks. And I guess from those answers you've given that you already agree with his sentiments, that when we break or when we carry an injury, our performance is affected. And that affects not just us personally, how we feel, how it affects our family, but it affects our patients, it affects, as you've already admitted, the decisions that you subsequently make. And it affects the organizations who employ us at considerable expense. So we are not good at looking after each other when things go wrong. And so in the next sort of 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what's known about this area, which you've demonstrated is important, and about some of the work that we've started to do in Bournemouth to try and look at this in a way which I hope is slightly more rigorous than what's gone before. So, of course, things go wrong in healthcare. We all know that. Every single healthcare professional knows that. Doctors feel that most acutely because in most healthcare systems it is doctors who carry ultimate responsibility for decision-making and therefore ultimate responsibility for what happens to the patient. But most acutely of all, surgeons know that when things go wrong, we are affected. And we feel that most acutely because of nuances that distinguish us from other doctors in what we do, and nuances that distinguish us from other doctors in terms of who we are. If a medication has a 5% chance of causing a side effect, and if a patient to whom you prescribe that medication experiences that side effect, then that's a problem with the medication. It's not a problem with you for prescribing it. If an operation has a 5% chance of the patient suffering a significant complication, and you're the surgeon who conducts that operation, and that patient is unfortunate enough to experience that complication, then the perception is that the problem is not with the operation, but it's with you. So we carry the can in a way in which other doctors don't. It's different for us because of who we are, and we are different. And there's quite a few studies of doctors in different walks of professional life which demonstrate that on validated measures of personality or emotional processing or character, that we are more resilient, we are more tough-minded, we are more decisive. And of course, we can argue whether surgery attracts people with those characteristics or whether the rigors of surgical training bring out or magnify those characteristics, but fundamentally, we are psychologically different from other doctors. But you've already demonstrated the truth in this quote, which is that though we are different, we all suffer, and the way in which we suffer when things go wrong can be quite profound. This is from a surgical trainee who was involved in an intraoperative adverse event. Now, of course, there is and always has been support, and many of us are fortunate to work in units where there's a great deal of support. But I wonder if you would agree with me that the support that we are accustomed to getting follows this kind of fairly predictable pattern, if you're lucky, this is. Which is firstly, when something goes wrong, you are reminded that you are good. So you're reminded that you are appropriately trained, that your previous experience of this operation demonstrates that you're good at it, and you are just good at what you do. You're then reminded that bad things happen to good people. Not because they're bad people, they're good people, but bad things happen because we walk close to the edge. And if you walk close to the edge, occasionally you'll fall over, and you don't fall over because you've forgotten how to walk, or you start walking in a way which is dangerous or judged to be incompetent by your colleagues. You fall over because bad things happen to good people. Then you will probably hear some stories which are usually from senior colleagues and which frequently are helpful, which say, let me tell you, I haven't told many people about this, but let me tell you when the same thing happened to me or something similar happened to me. And then in some way, you're going to be told to get up flying again, or get back in the kitchen, or get back on your horse. Just get back in the game, because that's what you need to do. And I suppose my contention is that surely we can do better than this, because patently this is not enough. And it's not enough because of this. And this is a quote from a UK consultant surgeon who contacted me personally when he read one of the things that we've written about this in Bournemouth. And he said, "It always feels callous to talk about the impact on yourself as the surgeon when you know the family have suffered so much more. Unfortunately, my trust didn't know how to handle me or the process, and I was not well supported. So the support that exists is inadequate. And it's not enough because of this. I felt and feel very guilty, but I remain disappointed by the lack of support from my employer. I felt I was treated like a criminal first, rather than any duty of care to me as an employee doing his job. I found it very difficult to talk about at home. It was only the support of my colleagues that enabled me to get through this period." And this was a surgeon who made a misidentification of anatomy, which led to a fatal complication for a young adult patient. What is going on is not enough. Surely we can do better than this for each other. So what do we know already? Well, as John will explain, there's quite a bit of literature about burnout and quite a bit of literature about burnout in medical professionals. But much of that literature does not dissect out and separate the impact of adverse events for surgeons. And that's what interests me the most. There is some literature to show that if you perceive yourself to have made a medical error, then that statistically increases your risk of subsequent burnout. But when we look at literature which does confine itself to adverse events, there really is precious little. It is nearly all from the United States, and of course, although there is much that would be translatable, there are differences in the system there. Very little of the literature is specific to surgeons. As I've alluded to already, I think there's a need to recognize the surgeon-specific nuance in this. And nearly all the literature confuses and conflates errors and complications, and as I will develop, I think that there is value in distinguishing between those two things. If that's what we know in the world, what do we know about the impact of adverse events on surgeons in the UK? And the answer is virtually nothing. This was a very valuable study done in London in 2013 by Pinto, who was a PhD student who did some interviews, interviewed 27 vascular and general surgeons, registrar and consultant grade, single point of contact, so a single interview with some structured questions. And it won't surprise you, because you've demonstrated this already, that the vast majority of respondents reported negative impact from an adverse event. They confessed that they were affected in one of the ways that we've already discussed. And Pinto was able to identify some things which influenced in some way the way in which the surgeon was affected. Was it something to do with the case? Did you know it was going to be a difficult case? Was it an emergency? Had the patient had previous surgery? Did they have morbidity? Was it something to do with the surgeon? Was the surgeon adequately trained, of adequate seniority? Were they adequately supported? Patient-related factors, by which Pinto meant how was the patient affected by the error? Not how bad was the error, but how bad was the impact? And perhaps more importantly, how did the patient then, and the patient's family then blame the surgeon? And institution-related factors. Surgeons identified that the way in which they processed adverse events depended to a great deal on whether their institution was one of a culture of blame or one of support, whether they were hung out to dry or whether or not they were supported in some way. But this aside, we know just about nothing about how we as UK surgeons experience adverse events and how we are affected by them. So with that context, a few years ago, I began to talk to colleagues in the Department of Psychology in Bournemouth about how we might begin to address this in the UK. And we reviewed the literature such as it is, and we began to write about some of the ideas that we had to try and address this in a slightly more rigorous and objective way. And we felt that we needed to do three things. We felt we needed to do our own qualitative study so that we could draw out some themes, and we could particularly focus on surgeon-specific nuances. And we wanted to explore errors and complications which we felt hadn't been done adequately previously. We felt there was a need for a national survey. As Kieran said in the session just before lunch, data trumps anecdote. And we need data. We need to know what the extent and breadth and depth of this problem is, because we can't improve upon something that we cannot measure. And I think most exciting for us, and I think uniquely in the world as far as we're aware, what we wanted to try and do is to see whether we could intervene for surgeons specifically for adverse events. Can we not only describe the problem, but can we help each other to deal better when things happen? So our qualitative study is completed. We did it locally in Bournemouth with surgeons of different grades and different seniorities, different specialties. And I won't run through all the themes that came out because they are obvious largely, except to focus on this business again of errors and complications. Because at the extremes of the scale, the difference between an error and a complication, I think, is reasonably clear. An error is a mistake. It's something that you did that you shouldn't have done or didn't do that you should have done, and where your peers would have judged that someone with your skills and knowledge and training should not have made that mistake. And it's a mistake whether or not there's an adverse outcome for the patient. A complication is something that we know that can happen even when all appropriate precautions are taken, because some procedures just have a degree of risk. And of course, at the extremes, they take, for example, a thromboembolism. Because we all know that measures to reduce the risk of thromboembolism work, but if you forget to connect and turn on the calf compression boots, or if someone forgets to prescribe subcutaneous heparin, and a patient gets a thromboembolism, then clearly that is an error. If, however, all evidence-based precautions have been taken to reduce the risk of a thromboembolism, and the patient still gets one, then that's a complication. So at the extremes, it's obvious. In the middle, of course, there's a grey area. You know, if a bowel anastomosis has a 1% chance of leaking, and it leaks, we know that's a complication, but we also know that the risk of that complication happening does depend on some technical factors, which could be the surgeon's fault. So we felt this was something that was worth continuing to explore. We then launched a national survey, and this went live towards the end of last year, in autumn of last year, and all fellows and members of the RCS England and RCS Edinburgh would have received an electronic invite to participate in this study. Two comments on that. Yes, of course, I know that these are not the only two surgical colleges, and I know that many surgeons would be members of their own colleges, but it takes quite a lot of time to get something like this through the various processes and approvals that you need to do, and we felt this was an appropriate place to start. I also recognise that many of you will be members or fellows of these colleges and may not have seen the survey invite because it came for all sorts of good reasons in the midst of a regular e-bulletin from one or other of the colleges. Those of you who have seen the survey will know that it's in two parts, that it is completely anonymised, it's managed, the data's managed and anonymised off-site, and it works through a number of structured questions which use validated measures together with the opportunity to put in some free text. And what we decided to do right at the outset was to randomly assign surgeons who participated to either receiving the questionnaire about errors or about complications. And this work is still ongoing. We're still gathering data from the survey. And what we're looking at is asking people to tell us what happened to them, factors they identified that contributed, the impact upon them, and so forth. And a number of validated measures are included. And then the third strand to what we're doing is can we make things better? Is it possible to prepare better than saying to a senior trainee or junior consultant, just so you know, something really, really bad is going to happen to you at some point, and this is how you're going to feel about it? Can we do better than that? And there is evidence to show that interventions can make a difference, for example, in burnout, and in other professions there is evidence to show that early intervention can in some way ameliorate response, but that's never been demonstrated in surgery. If resilience is a characteristic that we have, are there ways that we can enhance it and develop it before we really need to use it? So that's pre-exposure, if you like, but what about post-event? Is there something that we can provide which is effective and acceptable to surgeons, which isn't just seen as psychobabble, and which people believe in, and in which we can demonstrate in a randomized and validated way does actually make a difference and protect us from some of the things that we know that can happen? And this is really at a very early stage. We have a PhD student looking at this, and it's likely that we will use a validated psychological intervention called ACT, which is a sort of mixture of CBT and some mindfulness work. But what we're developing is a surgeon-specific tool, and what we're likely to do in the relatively near future is trial this, at least initially, with a group of surgical trainees, with a couple of training sessions, and then a review a few months down the line. We really, really need your help, and I think the frequency of your own experiences of adverse events shows how important this is. Please, if you haven't seen the survey, take the survey. Please encourage colleagues in your specialty and in your hospital to do so, and please, if you possibly could, ask the medical director and surgical CD to ask surgeons in your hospital to take part. To do so is easy. Go to our website, surgeonwellbeing.co.uk, and click on the link that says Take Our Survey. It takes you straight there. And finally, if you are more interested than just completing the survey, which I hope you will do, then come to our conference in Bournemouth, again accessible from our website, which is on Friday the 8th of September and is a whole day devoted to helping surgeons when things go wrong with a number of experts from across a range of specialties to start developing with us measures to improve matters. Bournemouth is a lovely place. We'll be meeting in our superb executive business centre, and if you get bored, there's still 7 miles of sandy beach that you can visit. These are some of the people that are speaking. You'll recognise some of the names. Worth highlighting: Claire Garada, former chair of the Royal College of GPs, now runs the only NHS-funded clinic for doctors who have experienced adverse events. I'll leave you with a quote from Osler: "Engrossed late and soon in professional cares, you may so lay waste your powers that you may find too late, with hearts given away, that there is no place in your habit-stricken souls for those gentler influences which make your life worth living." Let's hope that that does not apply to us. And my thanks go to my co-team in Bournemouth University and to the others that you see listed there. Thank you very much.
You will all have the app in front of you, and if there's time, the session is due to finish about 2:30, but if there's time, we'll try and take a couple of questions. John.
Mr. President, our Irish President of your British Association and honorary life member of our Irish Society, we're very proud of you. And thank you for this opportunity to show you what I believe, for us as urologists, burnout is not just psychobabble. Our workplace has undergone dramatic changes in recent decades, but unlike in contemporary industry, our archaic human resources management structures have not kept pace. I wish to describe the problem of burnout to you, the phenomenon. I will review its prevalence and its causes, clearly documented internationally and locally now. And I'd like to put forward some ideas regarding what I would consider a reasonable preventative action plan. You in this audience are all highly intelligent, all highly educated. You're ambitious, you're focused, you're perfectionists, you're achievers, and you thrive on stress at work. You might like to leave the room at this stage. You may say burnout is not for us. But you know what? It is some of your special talents and the special workplace, the special caring workplace, where excessive work volume, excessive long hours, total dedication to patients, perfect outcomes are assumed, and regardless of your personal preservation, you are at all times expected to go the extra mile by what is now an ever-demanding clientele, your patients, driven by the media and not accepted by your direct employers and your corporate employers, the government. You are actually at increased risk of burnout compared to the general workplace population, who are often less talented and less intelligent. Burnout is a psychological syndrome. It is not depression. It is not stress. Burnout occurs when excessive and prolonged work stress leads to a prolonged response of exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, known as depersonalization, where one treats people and patients as objects rather than human beings. And the third domain involves a loss of sense of personal achievement. This syndrome was described in the 1970s. The symptoms of burnout being chronic emotional and physical exhaustion may be accompanied by sleep disruption, eating disorders, and somatic symptoms such as headache, muscle pains, bowel dysfunction, menstrual disorder, cardiac arrhythmias. In addition, there are ongoing feelings of guilt and a sense of failure. Burnout can have serious, even catastrophic adverse events on the individual affected, both occupational and lifestyle, but can also have effects on his colleagues and also on your patients. For the individual affected, job dissatisfaction can lead to withdrawal, loss of commitment and absenteeism. Turnover and early retirement are clearly documented, and there may be serious spillover into one's personal life, causing family disruption. Depressive symptoms are documented in 38% of cases of burnout, and suicidal ideation in 6% from American figures. The disruptive effect of an individual's burnout on his or her colleagues can cause conflict at work, aggression, and unfortunately this can be contagious within departments and within hospitals. The impact of burnout on quality of care is clearly documented with a linear correlation. The American College of Surgeons studies on errors showed a clear association with burnout, but interestingly, not the amount of worked hours, the number of call-outs, or the type of practice involved. And of course, always in the background here, and not the purpose of this talk, is the issue of legal malpractice and its implications. Burnout and depression are considered distinct entities in occupational health. But workers with depression are more likely to develop burnout, and workers who have burnout are more likely to develop depression. And if severe, burnout and depression can have similar characteristics. Now, we do know the prevalence of burnout and its causes for surgeons, both internationally and locally now. In fact, we really don't need any studies of different specialities or regions unless it is to test the impact of a preventative action plan that we've started. The prevalence and severity of burnout are measured by the Maslach burnout inventory. The MBI quantifies the 3 domains of burnout: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, now known as cynicism, and a lack of personal achievement. This American research tool is validated, it's reproducible, and it's tested for significance by a thing called Cronbach's coefficient. It is widely accepted as a standard tool. Now, I want to sidetrack for a minute. If this was a Google seminar for workers and managers, not BAUS, my topic would not be burnout. We'd be talking about engagement, which is the antithesis of burnout, and how we would promote it in Google or Facebook or whatever progressive company we're involved in. And instead of exhaustion, we would be talking about vigor and how to promote it at work. Instead of depersonalization, we would be talking about personal interaction and its encouragement in the workplace. And instead of a lack of personal achievement, we would be talking about fulfillment and how to succeed with our employees. I would likely be presenting our work using the Utrecht Work Engagement Score. And of course, this would not be altruistic by Google that they'd have this seminar, because they would know that productivity and profit are directly dependent on employee engagement at work. The prevalence of burnout amongst the general working population is 28%. Amongst doctors, the burnout rate is considerably higher, and amongst American physicians ranks between 40 to 54%. There was some disquiet amongst urologists when the 2011 Mayo Clinic study revealed a 64% burnout rate amongst urologists, but subsequent studies have shown lesser rates. This, I would again emphasize, is amongst highly intelligent, highly trained individuals. Now, the Irish Society of Urology and BAUS have published our burnout rates for the UK and Ireland and identified causative factors. We use the Maslach burnout inventory, the standard tool, but really I felt its language was unattractive to us as non-psychologists, and we included and developed a urologist-friendly questionnaire. And there's no doubt that it did increase accrual, it yielded valuable additional data, and it was subsequently validated and can be used in future studies. The burnout rate in the UK and Ireland is 52%, with high levels of emotional exhaustion reported in 25% of individuals and high levels of depersonalization in 25%. Now, those levels may seem high to you, but they mirror those of international reports, and certainly they were not a surprise to my occupational health co-author. He said, these aren't surprising. Other interesting points: 11% report self-medication with prescription drugs, 17% admitted using alcohol or illicit drugs to cope with burnout at work, 8% of urologists have sought professional help, and 7% have sought time off work because of burnout. In identifying contributing factors, there was a positive statistical correlation with consultant status versus trainees, junior consultants less than 44 years of age, and posts with management responsibility. There was no statistical correlation with gender, ethnicity, or public-private case mix. Interestingly, there was a negative correlation with those in a research lead role. So in other words, involvement in research appears to be protective against burnout. Looking at individual stressors or causative factors, the top 3 stressors were excessive administration workload, overall work volume, and a lack of institutional resources. The least 3 stressors were operating room stress or pressure, clinical decision-making, and career opportunities. So, you know, our traditional concept of the happy or the fulfilled surgeon still applies. When are we happiest and most productive? It's when we're encouraged and facilitated to see our patients, diagnose them, operate on them, and help them. Moving on to prevention, reducing the incidence and severity of burnout really has to be tackled at a number of levels. At individual level, because of our special work, and it is special work, we as students, as trainees and consultants should be aware and trained in detecting and self-prevention of burnout. That does not apply to the people you started off in college, who started off in law or physics or whatever. There is a clear role for our direct employers, our hospitals. There is, I believe, a role for our institutions, such as College of Surgeons and BAUS. And lastly, there is a major role for our governments, departments of health, which ultimately govern our workplace environment. They are our corporate employers with corporate human resources responsibility. At individual level, our data indicates that 80% of urologists consider they should be evaluated for burnout. 60% would discuss burnout with colleagues, and 60% would avail of workplace counselling if available and if needed. So these positive findings indicate we should be able to devise a plan to promote early awareness, early detection, early engagement, and therefore effective early reversal of burnout. I'm not a life coach, but we're all familiar with the terminology work-life balance, self-awareness, or the more modern term mindfulness, and the importance of exercise, diet, etc., being healthy in mind, body, and soul, etc. The research is conclusive internationally and locally what action is required at hospital level. They must reduce our administrative workload by increasing support staff and resources. In the USA, where 1 hour in a clinic now generates 90 to 120 minutes of admin workload, they are supplying scribes. We and our hospitals need to control an ever-increasing work volume at referral source. And there must be sequential responsibility. There is absolutely no logic in a urologist or his unit deciding on a work schedule if the next layer of management, i.e. Department of Health or government or whatever, for political expediency or for whatever reason, then dictates other unrealistic goals and, moreover, penalties if those targets are not met. In other words, we're talking about workplace support. Regarding our professional bodies, the College of Surgeons are introducing modules in BST and HSE to increase awareness, including a mentoring process and a support structure. At BAUS, I believe there could be a role for job description monitoring, monitoring posts and the volume of work involved, etc. At deanery level, there are some with established services for doctors in distress, but perhaps that is too late, and indeed those services are now subject to financial cutbacks. The medical indemnity organisations and the Medical Council have expressed an interest in burnout, but I suspect, or I would consider that with a double-edged sword because of their loyalties. But as mentioned, all the supports at individual, hospital, professional bodies level are meaningless unless there is corporate governmental support for the service itself. Also, at governmental level, burnout must be recognised as a defined, measurable occupational health disorder. And as employers, they must accept responsibility for their employees' unacceptable high rate of burnout. This is a paradigm shift from the traditional view that burnout was due to the weak employee with the weak personality. This modern definition of burnout is accepted in mainland Europe, in mainland Northern Europe, but has yet to spread elsewhere. And in fact, in the United States, it is resisted where financial implications for employers, insurance bodies, etc., take precedence. So I would suggest to you that burnout in urologists is not just psychobabble. It's an aspect of modern human resources management that you must be aware of. Firstly, because you're at higher risk than other professions. And secondly, because your employees' human resources management lags way behind accepted normal standards. And if we revert to the scenario of a Google seminar for employees and management, we would instead be considering the areas of workplace model with its 6 domains. There would be agreement that employee workload should be sustainable and manageable. We would be talking about control at work and the capacity of the employee to influence and manage. We would be talking about reward, but not just material reward. We would be talking about recognition at work and personal satisfaction and its promotion. Our employers would be encouraging community and the importance of colleagues, support and trust, and teamwork. Decision-making is vitally important for employees. Not only should there be fairness in decision-making, but there should be perceived fairness in decision-making. There would be corporate values accepted by employers and employees, and as such, connection, loyalty would be encouraged, and with all that in place, there would then be personal freedom for employers. Sadly, much of this is lacking in our present workplace environment. Thank you, and take care.
Well, unfortunately, we have almost run out of time because the next session will begin very shortly. But what have we learned? Well, we've learned that 90% of the audience had a significant surgical complication that had weighed on them heavily. 90% thought that they got very poor support in relation to the problems that have arisen. We know that burnout affects 40 to 50% of urologists, so there will be some in this room who will feel that, and that there are certain strategies that we can take to move forward. I had one question that was put in. It was, would BAUS consider a course at the annual meeting to increase reliance, educate members about self-help? The answer is yes. Thank you.